place card was still on the table. It sat pressed flat beside Anne's empty chair, centred between the water glass and the bread plate. The name on the card was not Anne's. It was Laura Lopes, and the chair it held was not Laura's by service, by title, or by any calendar of contribution. It was held by a single fact. Camilla wanted it there. Charles saw it on a Thursday evening while reviewing the seating arrangement for a family dinner at Windsor. The table plan had been laid out by the household staff on a narrow oak-side table in the corridor outside the dining room. 8 settings, 8 name cards, one of them protecting a seat that had nothing to do with the person who would sit in it. That is where this story begins. Not with an insult, not with a tour, with a card that had been left in place because removing it was harder than keeping it. To understand why Charles finally lifted it, you need to understand the problem the card was solving. Months earlier, an insult had landed at Anne's feet during a family gathering. Someone close to Camilla's family circle had spoken in a way that diminished Anne's service. The words stayed inside the room. Staff carried on. The insult remained between 2 women at opposite ends of the same institution. She met with officials. She inspected facilities. She shook hands in corridors where the air conditioning had failed and the temperature pressed against her formal clothes like a weight. She did not shorten her schedule. She did not cancel the agricultural inspection that required standing in open sun for 40 minutes. Anne did not escalate. She did not demand an apology. She did not raise it with Charles or with the household. She absorbed it the way she absorbs most personal costs. She continued working. She left for South Korea and Thailand on an official program that included diplomatic meetings, charity engagements, and agricultural inspections. She served. The insult remained in the room she had left behind, and the place card stayed on the table. Camilla's response to the incident was not confrontation. It was protection. She ensured that the person connected to the insult retained family access. The seat at the dinner table, the name card on the oak surface, the visible evidence that nothing had changed. This was not cruelty, it was strategy. If the seat disappeared, the family would know something had happened. If the card was removed, the removal itself would become the story. Keeping the card was the cheapest way to maintain the appearance that the insult had been absorbed without consequence. That was the problem the protection was solving, not loyalty to her daughter, not defiance of Anne. The card kept the surface calm, and calm inside a family that operates as a public institution is the most valuable commodity anyone can protect. Charles understood this. He had lived inside it for decades. Every family dinner at Windsor carried a second architecture beneath the visible one. Every seating arrangement was a statement about access, proximity, and standing. A chair is not a chair. It is a signal about who belongs and at what cost. Removing a card is not a logistical decision. It is a verdict. And Charles did not want to issue a verdict. Not yet. Not while the cost of removing the card was higher than the cost of leaving it. The problem is that costs change. Anne returned from her South Korea and Thailand tour in the 3rd week of July. Her official programme stretched across diplomatic meetings, charity work, and agricultural inspections. She crossed corridors, reviewed projects, and stood in heat that would have kept most people inside. She was 75 years old. She had not taken a rest day. Charles reviewed the tour summary that his private secretary placed on his desk the following morning. The folder was thin. Anne's tours always were. No press controversies. No logistical complaints. No requests for additional staff or upgraded accommodation. Just the itinerary, the completed engagements, and a note from the British Embassy confirming the diplomatic outcomes. He closed the folder and set it on the left side of his desk. On the right side, where his equerry had placed it that morning, sat the seating plan for the family dinner. Laura's card was still listed beside Anne's empty chair. The service record sat on one side of the desk. The protected seat sat on the other. The gap between them was the question. Why should the person who served be governed by the person who insulted? Charles had 3 options. He could leave the card in place. That would preserve family calm. Camilla would not be challenged. The dinner would proceed without tension. The cost would be invisible to everyone except Anne. She would arrive, see the name beside her chair, and understand that nothing had changed. Her tour, her service, and her absorbed insult would mean nothing. The card would remain. The lesson would be that protection outweighs service. He could raise the seating question with Camilla directly. That would honour Anne's service without issuing a verdict. He could explain that the optics of the seating arrangement had become difficult. He could suggest a rotation, a different table, a larger gathering that dispersed the visible proximity. The cost would be a conversation that Camilla would interpret as a challenge to her family's standing. The card would eventually move, but it would move as a compromise, not as a consequence. Or he could remove the card himself. That would be a verdict. Physical, visible, irreversible in the eyes of everyone present. The chair would be empty until he filled it with someone else. Camilla would see the removal as an act against her family. The household staff would register it as a decision by the king. There would be no cover story, no rotation, no ambiguity. The card would be gone because Charles took it. Each option protected something different. The first protected calm. The second protected the marriage. The third protected Anne. Anne did not ask for any of them. She arrived at Windsor 2 days before the dinner. She walked through the corridor where the seating plan was displayed. She saw the card. She said nothing. She did not stop. She did not reach for it. She did not mention it to Charles or to any member of staff. She walked past the table, continued down the corridor, and went to her rooms. That was the first irreversible move, though it did not look like one. Anne's refusal to engage with the seating plan removed the possibility of a quiet compromise. If she had objected, Charles could have framed the removal as a response to a complaint. He could have positioned it as mediation. Anne's silence stripped that option away. If the card moved now, it would move because Charles chose to move it. The motive would be his alone. Camilla saw the same silence and drew a different conclusion. She read Annie's restraint as acceptance. The card was still on the table. Anne had walked past it. The protection was working, and she strengthened the argument. She told Charles that evening in the drawing room that the seating arrangement reflected family unity. The card was not a reward. It was a statement that the family does not punish proximity for private friction. Removing it would signal a fracture that did not need to exist. Her voice was steady. Her logic was sound. And Charles nearly agreed. He sat in the armchair beside the window. The evening light crossed the room in long amber bands. Camilla stood near the fireplace, one hand resting on the mantelpiece. She was not arguing. She was explaining calmly that the card had been in place for months and nobody had suffered for it. The family operated. The events continued. The surface held. Why break it now? Charles looked at the window. The garden below was quiet. He could hear a bird settling in the copper beech and the faint sound of a car on the gravel drive. His hand rested on the arm of the chair. His fingers did not move. For a moment, He was going to leave the card where it was. The marital cost was real. If he removed the card, Camilla would see it as a judgment on her family. Not a correction, a judgment. And Charles knew that a judgment, once issued inside a marriage, does not retract. It sits between two people the way a card sits on a table, visible, present, named. He almost left the setting unchanged. The evening light was fading. The amber bands on the carpet had narrowed to thin lines. The bird in the copper beech had gone quiet. Charles could hear his own breathing and the distant sound of the kitchen staff setting plates in the dining room below. The dinner was 3 hours away. The card was still on the table, and the easiest path was the one that required him to do nothing at all. Inaction has no author. If the card stayed, nobody had made a decision. It had simply remained. The protection would continue, the surface would hold, and the cost would be paid quietly by the one person who never complained about paying it. Then he stood. He did not answer Camilla's argument. He walked to the side table in the corridor, where the seating plan was still laid out. His equerry was standing near the door. Charles waved him away. He looked at the card. Laura Lopes. Beside Anne's chair. The calligraphy was the same as every other card on the table. The paper was the same weight. The placement was centred, deliberate, correct. He placed Anne's tour folder on the table beside the seating list. The folder was thin. The card was small. Side by side, they told the whole story. One represented 2 weeks of service in heat and protocol and exhaustion. The other represented months of protection for an insult that nobody had answered. Charles picked up the card. He held it between his thumb and forefinger. The paper was stiff but light. He folded it once, precisely, along the printed name. Then he placed it in his jacket pocket. The card in his pocket weighed almost nothing. He could feel the folded edge against his chest through the fabric. The paper was warm from the table. He pressed his hand flat over the pocket and held it there for a moment. The dining room was silent. The setting where the card had been was now an empty space between the glass and the bread plate. He turned to his equerry and gave one instruction. He named Anne's chosen guest, a friend she had known for decades, someone who had worked alongside her at charitable engagements for years. He asked for a new card to be written and placed in the empty setting before dinner. The equerry nodded. He did not ask why. Anne's guest arrived that evening and sat in the chair that had been Laura's for months. The table was full. 8 settings, 8 people. The guest looked at the service record that had been placed on the side table in the corridor and smiled. She did not know the history of the card. She did not need to. She was there because Anne had chosen her, and Charles had cleared the space. Anne sat beside her friend. Her posture did not change. Her expression did not shift. She looked at the table once, at the new card in the old setting, and then she looked at Charles. The look lasted less than 2 seconds. It said nothing that anyone else in the room could have read. But Charles held it. The cost arrived before dessert. Camilla's posture was perfect throughout the meal. She spoke to every guest. She complimented the food. She did not look at the empty side of the table where her daughter's card had been. But she did not look at Charles either. When she reached for her glass, her hand was steady. When she set it down, the stem clicked against the plate. Just once, just loud enough for him to hear. Charles did not explain. He did not apologise. He absorbed the silence the way Anne had absorbed the insult. The card in his pocket pressed against his chest as he leaned forward to pass the salt. He felt it shift with every movement. He left it there. That was the winner's price. Charles accepted Camilla's anger and owned the boundary. He could not share it with Anne because Anne had not asked for it. He could not share it with the household because the removal was personal. The family boundary was his to draw and his to maintain. If it held because he held it. If it broke because he let go. The seat was never about dinner. That was the late reveal, and it changed everything that came before it. The card was not access to a table. It was immunity made physical. As long as the card sat in its place, the insult had no consequence. Camilla's protection was not about family unity. It demonstrated that proximity could survive anything. Access was unconditional. Service and loyalty were irrelevant to the question of who sat beside whom. The card made the insult permanent by making the seating permanent. It turned a private wrong into a public fixture. Removing the card did not erase the insult. It ended the immunity. And here is the reading most people skip. Camilla may not have been protecting the insult. She may have been protecting her daughter from a visible humiliation. Every guest would have seen the empty chair. Every staff member would have registered the removal. A mother ensuring that her child was not exiled from a table her stepfather controlled. That reading is not dramatic, but it fits the evidence just as well. Protection and immunity look identical from the outside. The difference is in the motive, and the motive belongs to Camilla alone. Charles did not claim to know it. He only knew what the card cost Anne, and he decided that the cost was too high. The drying wax on the replacement card set into the new name while the dinner continued. 8 people at a table, one of them a guest Anne had chosen, one of them a wife who had not been consulted. The conversation was polite. The food was served. The evening ended the way Windsor evenings always end, with coffee in the drawing room and quiet footsteps on the stone corridor afterward. But the card in his pocket remained. Charles did not remove it after dinner. He did not set it on a side table or hand it to his equerry. He left it folded in his jacket pocket when he hung the jacket in his dressing room that night. The paper sat against the lining, creased along the name. It carried the weight of a decision that every family table afterward would feel. The motive was simple. Protection solves a problem until the problem it creates is larger than the problem it hides. Charles did not remove the card because he was angry. He removed it because the cost of keeping it had finally exceeded the cost of taking it. Anne's service record sat on one side of the desk. The protected seat sat on the other. And somewhere between South Korea and Windsor, the balance shifted. Once you see the pattern, you will recognise it in every family seating arrangement that follows. Watch who sits beside whom at the next state dinner. Watch whether the card returns. Watch whether the guest Anne chose is invited again. These are not ceremonial details. They are the visible surface of a motive that has already been acted on. The answer will be written on a small piece of cardstock between a water glass and a bread plate, as it always is. The corridor beyond the dining room smelled of coffee and extinguished candles. Staff lifted the final glasses from the cloth. One chair scraped softly, then settled beneath the table. Anne and her guest crossed toward the drawing room together. Charles stayed behind long enough to see. Their place settings remained side by side. Camilla stood in the doorway after the last guest had gone. Charles walked toward the stairs with one hand over his jacket pocket. His fingers pressed the folded card against his chest. He did not turn around. She watched his hand until it disappeared beyond the stone archway. The place beside Anne remained filled by the guest Anne had chosen.